people thought they were coming to a talk about Smithville and Atlantic County. That's always, see, that's good. That's always good to get out of the way.
Yeah.
We hear that, especially this time of year, as I'm working in Smithville here in Burlington County, people start showing up for Zombie Fest. And we just don't have Zombie Fest at Smithville. But just to add to the confusion, that is historic Smithville Village, and we are historic Smithville Park. We just happen to have a village in our park. So it gets complicated. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to leave some flyers here. So leading up to the holiday season, and you'll get to see some of the pictures of stuff that goes on there. But during the holiday season, the mansion has different organizations, garden clubs, things like that, come in and decorate different rooms in the mansion. They do candlelit tours, which is really nice. And what we do on the nights they have candlelit tours, the Parks Department, we have village tours. So we have lights all over the village. There's luminaries that line the walks. We get to dress up in costumes and carry lanterns and tell the story that you're going to hear tonight. So I'm not ruining it for anybody. You can bring your friends and come early and do a village tour, and then you'll get the experience that I like to have when I tell the story. So, historic Smithville. Originally, we know going way back, this is actually a map from 1673, Herman's map of 1673, that shows the Delaware River here. This is the Rancocas Creek, the south branch going that way, the north branch coming this way. And this place called Alumata is where Smithville is today. Here in the Forks is a historic Native American village that was called Sandhickney. And then this one out in Delran doesn't have a name, but it's considerable. You can tell by the size of the houses. That was his interpretation, how many houses there were. And all of those places now are part of the Parks Department. So they'll be preserved forever. In fact, the one out in Delran, they found so much evidence, material remains, that they scaled back the plan. They were going to put in bathrooms and picnic pavilions and stuff, but because of the Native American presence there, they scaled it way back. So Alumata, so Native American village going back prehistorically. Parker's Mill by the time of the American Revolution. And I tell people about this house all the time. I say, you know, the old farmhouse that, you know, dates back to the 1750s. And they're like, I don't remember a farmhouse. I say, it sits right on Smithville Road. And they're like, I don't remember a farmhouse. And it's because it sits across, of course, from this beautiful mansion with the wall that goes around it. So unfortunately, our poor Revolutionary War farmhouse gets ignored from time to time. So in the 1830s, it was known as Shreveville. Two brothers named Shreve made a textile mill. So they were spinning cotton thread, dyeing cotton fabrics, things like that. And they ran into trouble right before the American Civil War. They had trouble getting cotton, for obvious reasons, and they ended up going bankrupt. And the Smiths, it was actually for sale for a while. They actually were able to buy this place pretty much like it would have been right there for about $23,000. So that would have been the factory complex, the village houses, and a mansion. So pennies on the dollar, still a lot of money at that time. It's 1865 when they take over. And here are our heroes. The very beautiful Agnes Matilda Gilkerson Smith. And these are actually modern portraits that are done from photographs. But Agnes, very beautiful, and that's her husband, Hezekiah. We say he's very smart. And Mr. Smith designed woodworking machinery. So he started off life as a carpenter's apprentice. Oh, I forgot to ask the most important question. Who likes a good love story? Let me see your hands. Okay, great. The rest of you are realists. I like that too. Good for you. So what I'm going to tell you here is this magnificent love story between these two. So that's not to be lost. It's very important when we talk about our heroes here. Yeah, Hezekiah was very bright, started off as a carpenter's apprentice, and eventually started making his own line of woodworking machinery that he would then sell to businesses that made sash and blinds, they made windows, they made doors. So on an industrial scale, he was producing these machines. There's one from very early on. It's a molding machine. This was his masterpiece, the double-ended tenon. So not very romantic, the woodworking industry. But certainly for the Smiths, it was a great time to be in the woodworking business, or the machine building business. Right after the Civil War, we're rebuilding the South. The whole country is moving west, so he had sales offices in St. Louis and Chicago, and shipped these all over the world. And this is what we think is possibly one of the last machines they made at Smithville. They actually did business till 1969 as the H.B. Smith Machine Company, right up here in East Hampton. So remarkable what they could do. And Agnes was one of the famous Lowell Mill girls. So these were young ladies that were taken right off of the farm, worked in Lowell, Massachusetts in textile factories. For the girls, it was kind of a double-edged sword. There were good things, there were bad things. For them, it was a chance at independence. They wouldn't have been dependent on a husband or a father financially. They could come to the city, and there were intellectual things they could do. There were libraries, lecture halls, concert halls, newspapers, all the things they would have never seen on the farm. It was a chance for them to come here to Lowell and see those things. Of course, you also had to work in a crummy factory for 10 or 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They've actually come up with, it's not a Broadway musical, but it's a traveling musical about the Lowell Mill girls. And the Lowell Mill girls actually printed their own newspaper, and there were stories about them. So if you go to Lowell, Massachusetts, it's actually a big deal to talk about the Lowell Mill girls. And Agnes actually made the best of her situation. She was just as bright as she was beautiful. She actually went to finishing school in Lowell and then went to medical school here in Philadelphia. So in 1863, when she graduated, she would have been among the first classically trained women physicians. So we're quite impressed with Agnes and what she was able to do. So this is what the factory would have looked like in the Smith heyday. This photograph up here was actually taken from Mr. Smith's 120-foot tower that he built so he could survey his empire. This is part of the factory with the Rancocas Creek going by right here. And they actually use water power in the factory to power everything. So the creek would have backed up into Smithville Lake, which you can see just up in the corner behind here. They would have raised the gate at the back here. That would have come into the factory, turned some turbines, and then that would have been turned a belt that went around the factory, and then a shaft that would have run through everything. When you were ready to work, you throw a lever, and then you were in business. They actually had an elevator that would have taken machines. There's a little light rail for trolleys here. You'd wheel the machine onto here. They'd do whatever they had to do, back out here, up to the next floor, do whatever they had to do, and work that way. So it's really quite impressive for sure. Here's a look at some of the guys, and this is the office. One of the things the Smiths did was trying to get away from the way things were with the mill girls in Lowell, is they didn't allow women to do manual labor in the factory. Now, while we may think that's a little odd that women, of course, can do anything. Why not a factory job? Why would they have to work? But they thought it was demeaning to the women to have them do this labor. So Mr. Smith insisted no women, no children in the factory. So kind of a motley crew there for sure. But yeah, they went on spreading. The other thing they built there later on was the American Star bicycle. Yep. So it's the bicycle age. The big innovation that the Smiths came up with was putting the little wheel on the front of the bicycle. If you're familiar with the penny farthings, they had the wheel on the back, and it made quite a difference. They were a little bit more stable. They won more races. The pedals were a ratchet style instead of going around, so you could push them both at the same time, or you could push them one at a time. So yeah, quite interesting that time. Yep, this is what the village would have looked like when the Smiths took over. There was a whole line of 3-story duplexes on the north side of what we call Maple Avenue. There was a whole row of houses kind of similar like this on the south side, and there was a whole row on the top here at Park Avenue. Now, Mrs. Smith felt the village was a little crowded when she took over, so she had most of the houses on the south side here torn down, and she had all the houses on Park Avenue torn down and replaced with better houses. We always say it's a woman's prerogative. You buy a village, you want to redecorate a little bit, and so she did. The women were encouraged to plant gardens, so they needed more room, and the Smiths were trying to build what they would call the ideal industrial village. They wanted to pay their guys better than average. They gave them a better than average place to live. So if you were a mechanic with a family, you would have had a pretty nice house to live in. Mechanic's house. So this is a 4-story brick structure. If you would have gone in on the first floor, you would have had some retail businesses, and up here on top of the hill, you would have gone in on the second floor, and then third and fourth floor above you. And this was a dormitory for the single mechanics. So if you had a family, you would have lived in one of the houses, but if you were a single guy or an apprentice, you would have lived here at Mechanics Hall. So it had all the normal stuff, a dining room, and the rooms, of course, and I mentioned the retail shops, but what was different here, instead of having the bar room and the pool hall, Mrs. Smith had a library and meeting rooms put in, and there was actually an 800-seat opera house that was attached to it. So with a balcony here, you could see the stage with benches that were all lined up, and they would entertain. The people of the village would put on shows. They would also try and hire people from Philadelphia and New York to come in and perform. So it was quite the place. Certainly not your normal industrial village that we're used to hearing about from Dickens. There was also a general store, and the general store sold everything at cost. So again, not like we're used to. You hear of like the coal mining towns out in Kentucky where at the end of the week you owe the company money somehow. They had a farm complex across the street. There was a granary, a creamery. So really, really a different place. One odd fact here, the general store here was run by this guy, and it was also where the post office was. And at one point the post office came in and they needed to do an audit. And they found some irregularities in the books, and this guy was dismissed. And sadly, less than a week later, the whole place burned down. Maybe coincidence, and the evidence with it, right? So, bicycle railroad. I'll let you look at this for a second, soak that in, see if you can tell what you're looking at there. Yeah, so that is the one and only, never before seen, never since repeated bicycle railroad. It actually ran 2 miles from Smithville into the town of Mount Holly. And you can see the tracks going across the Rancocas Creek and into town there. It's basically a horse fence with a thin metal rail on top. The tires had grooves in it, and just like the American Star, you didn't pedal around, you pedaled up and down. And you could be in Mount Holly in 7 minutes, they say. So extraordinary. People, there's nothing else. There's no parallel to it. So if you get to stop up in Smithville, we actually have one of those on display in Mr. Smith's billiard room, of course. So Mr. Smith's conservatory, back in his day, every self-respecting thousandaire had to have his own conservatory, and Mr. Smith was no different. It was a glorified greenhouse, but Mr. Smith's was a tropical greenhouse. So he had tropical flowers, tropical plants, and tropical birds. And it was made out of cast iron and glass. And what's interesting here is that you can't see the rest of the mansion, but just out of sight here is the mansion. And in Mr. Smith's day, you could walk across this corridor and then into this stair tower, the proverbial secret staircase. You could come downstairs, and then he would be out on this balcony and in the middle of his own little Garden of Eden. He also had his own menagerie, his own zoo. So black bear, elk, white-tailed deer, and he also kept a pet moose named February. Did I mention that Mr. Smith was a politician? Yeah. So Mr. Smith was a politician, and somehow he came across this moose. He would travel. He'd go to Maine and to Canada, places like that, and they got a moose, and they trained it to pull a cart. And moose are generally ill-tempered, if you're familiar with moose at all. Yeah. But somehow they got this thing to pull a cart. We have pictures. I don't have one on here, I don't think. Moose pulling Mr. Smith's cart. So I do have one. So this is a happy couple you can imagine. Very wealthy, very popular. Mrs. Smith would cause a stir, driving her own team of horses to church on Sundays into Mount Holly. And of course, Mr. Smith, the big shot politician. There is one interesting thing. I mentioned before that Mrs. Smith was a physician. Well, they had a newspaper that doubled as their machine catalog that went out all over the country. And the first couple of pages were just their machines, but then the last sections were, human interest, public interest stuff that they would put in there. And the guy who was editing the newspaper at one point wrote, there are at this time so many women physicians in the county, it is hard to find a well man. So Mrs. Smith took exception to that, and then she started editing the newspaper and writing some really, really bright stuff. Science, nature, travel, philosophy, medicine. So she was really the whole package. Again, you can see this is from the photographs of them. Very beautiful, and just as bright as she was beautiful. We give her almost all the credit for the sociological aspects of Smithville Village. He was the businessman, he was the inventor, very bright guy, but she was everything else. So there's Mr. Smith. He's the picture of the moose there. Vote for Smith. Mr. Smith didn't actually drive the cart, so probably an indication of how bright he was. And he got elected to a seat in Congress in 1878. Started serving in 1879. Okay, so it was after this is, of course, when everything went downhill in Smithville once he got elected to Congress. Did I mention the scandal at all? I didn't, not at the beginning. I didn't mention the scandal. How clumsy of me. So Mr. Smith gets elected to a seat in Congress in 1878, and just 2 weeks after he's elected, this article appears in the New York Times. A congressman's predicament. One wife in Vermont and another in New Jersey. Wow, right? So what goes on here? So we try not to justify Mr. Smith's actions, but there's certainly an explanation. How about that? Up for an explanation? Mr. Smith, as a young man growing up in rural Vermont, he and his girlfriend, 19 years old, find themselves in the family way, as sometimes happens, even back in the 1800s. And they ran off and they got married. And Mr. Smith moves to Manchester, New Hampshire, and he's going to start his machining business there. It's an up-and-coming city. So they move there, and they're only there a short time, and there's a scarlet fever epidemic. So the original Mrs. Smith, Eveline Verona English Smith, fearing for the health of their young daughter, moves back to their hometown of Woodstock, Vermont, and the two of them never lived together again as husband and wife. They did manage to have 2 more children. So there were some visits, certainly, and Mr. Smith took care of his family financially and set his wife up with a shiny new sewing machine so she could support herself and add to the fortune, I guess. But as things happen, he moved his machine-making business to Lowell, Massachusetts. He meets the very beautiful Agnes, and the two fall in love. So he goes and he asks his first wife for a divorce, and she declines. She has nothing to gain. They're already not living together. So he kind of takes matters into his own hands. He asks for any correspondence they've had over the years and tosses it into the parlor stove. He then goes to his sister's house and retrieves the family Bible and extricates any mention of the original wife and children from the family Bible, deposits a large sum of money in the local bank in his wife's maiden name, and considers himself divorced. He then moves with Agnes. They get married, and they move down to Smithville, and they create this empire. Then sadly, every good love story, of course, has a tragic and sad ending. Before he's even done his first term in Congress, Agnes dies tragically young. She's only 43 years old. And in fact, Mr. Smith is devastated. He says, "Attended the funeral of my wife today and expect no more happiness in this world." So tragic, he was devastated. And in fact, he commissioned a marble statue in Agnes's likeness from Italy. And he had it placed in the south garden in her favorite spot, right across from the farm complex. She used to like to go sit there and read. She was a farm girl. And it's right outside of his bedroom window where he could wake up in the morning and look out and see Agnes still in her favorite spot.
That's the divorce problem.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, so he's very, very sad. And then just a couple years later, Mr. Smith dies. Did I mention he was a little bit older than her? It's only 23 years, so it's hardly worth mentioning at all. But in 1887, just 6 years later, Mr. Smith passes away. And then what you have is a 10-year-long court battle between the officers of the company, that's them, and Mr. Smith's oldest son, Elton Smith. Now, Elton has become wealthy in his own right, mostly by marrying the very wealthy daughter of the Hibernia Bank president in Savannah, Georgia, his daughter. So he comes into a lot of money, he starts his own business. He doesn't need Smithville by any stretch, but he wants it terribly. So 10-year-long court battle, both sides do everything they can to disparage poor Agnes. She was this home wrecker, she was this harlot, she controlled Mr. Smith. He wasn't in charge of his own faculties. He couldn't make his own calls. What would, drive a man to desert his family? It must be this woman. So tragic that they do that, certainly to Agnes. But after 10 years, they find in favor of the Smith family. Elton, his mother passes away, so he buys out his other two siblings, and he becomes the king of Smithville. And he moves in. Triumph of the son. He actually came with the Smiths in 1865 to start this business in Smithville. And shortly after he got there, there was a falling out of some sort. And he walked up the road. About a mile away was the train station, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he jumped on it and moved to Philadelphia for a short while. So very likely he never saw his father again. We're not sure what the source of the fallout might have been. Could have been that his dad was living with another woman. That's probably likely. But 10 years, the triumph of the son, Elton comes in, and first thing he does is he orders a team of men into the South Garden, and he has Agnes's statue demolished and thrown into the Rancocas Creek. Yeah, he might have been a little bitter. So he's certainly not done, though. Then he gets a team of men, and there's Rancocas Creek, what a beautiful bridge. We tried to get that one put back when this other one was messed up and taken so long, but they wouldn't have it. So he gets a team of men, and he sends them to St. Andrew's Cemetery in Mount Holly. Yeah, he's going to disinter his father. He's going to dig him up, and he's going to ship him up to Vermont, again, where his mother has since died, and have the two of them married together. Well, a team of men go into the cemetery, and they only have to dig for a short while, and they realize that Mr. Smith has entombed himself with a latticework of concrete and iron, so that he can't be moved. Short of dynamite, you're not getting him out of there. So the love story continues with Agnes and Hezekiah, albeit in the cemetery on Pine Street. But there's Agnes has this beautiful ornate stone that Mr. Smith provided for her. The stone next to it is his, and that's a modern stone because the news reports say that though they couldn't get the body out of there, Elton decided to abscond with the headstone and took that up to Woodstock. And some reports say that they had a mock burial there, that there may even be an empty casket sitting in a cemetery up in Woodstock. And then, like I said, Elton went on to run the town admirably, even though he was not well liked. But they did business again until 1969. And there was a story that there was a contract offered to them from Black & Decker to make home table saws, and that the subsequent Smiths and the company decided it wouldn't be worth re-outfitting the factory to continue on, so they missed out on that. But yeah, by the 1920s, the third generation of Smiths had taken over. A ton of money, so a ton of fun. It's Prohibition, so plenty of drinks. We have pictures of them hanging out on the mansion steps drinking when they probably shouldn't have. And by the 1950s, the last two remaining Smith granddaughters were elderly now. They couldn't take care of the mansion. They moved into one of the village houses, actually, one of the workers' houses. And a woman named Grace Thomas, I want to say, moved into the mansion and broke it up into apartments and was an artist. She wanted to have an artist colony there. And she did for a little while until 1977, and Burlington County bought it and made it the center of the Parks Department. So yeah, if you go there, there's trails. There's actually a floating trail that winds its way across Smithville Lake that actually floats right on top of the water. There's the Underground Railroad Museum, which is very pertinent, of course, here because it features William Still, who was the father of the Underground Railroad. And there's also the Annex Gallery. I don't think I have a picture of the Annex Gallery. So just off of this, you can't see, but on the back side of the mansion, one of the other things Mr. Smith did to assuage his grief when his wife passed away was built a casino wing. So there's a section of the mansion that is a dining room, bar room, poker room, billiard room, and bowling alley. And we use it today to show artwork. So it's an art gallery. And again, if you come in, the slips are up here for the holiday celebrations we do in December. You can come in and we'll do a tour for you. Bring your friends, and if you come early from 6 to 7, you get a village tour, and at 7 o'clock you can go into the mansion for their candlelight tour. So, that's any questions? No? Great.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Pertaining to the railroad, the bay headline that goes from Mount Holly to Pemberton, which is all torn up.
Yes.
Did that contribute to any of the of Smithville, like in terms of freight or machinery or whatever?
Yeah, the Pennsylvania Railroad is just a couple of miles up,
Right.
about a mile, which is actually inconvenient. So it raises more questions with us than actually we can answer. So there is a coal track up there. It's kind of like a side track. It's made out of concrete. And they used to use so much coal that just like some companies have a dumpster, and when the dumpster's full, they come pick it up and give you an empty one. Well, it was the same way with this coal car. They would drop off a full one. When it was empty, they would come and pick it up. And there was also a warehouse that sat next to the railroad track. But it's about a half a mile from the actual factory. So how they got these big heavy machines up there, I'm not sure. I guess they probably loaded them on a horse and a wagon and had some kind of pulley system to get them off and load them onto freight trains. There is something interesting though. The last person that was the postmaster for Smithville, they had a post office there, and her name was Edith Vaughn. And she actually was postmaster there for a while, and then in the 1950s, they started fingerprinting, the post office started fingerprinting the postmasters. Well, she used to carry the burlap sack of mail, you know, the half a mile up to the railroad tracks, and she would, you know, just like you see on Bugs Bunny, she would hang it on a hook, and the rail thing would come by. Well, when they went to fingerprint her, she had no thumbprint because she had been carrying that burlap sack for so long, and it had rubbed her thumbprint off. I will tell you another interesting point since you bring up the railroad. All along, once you get into Smithville, there's a marl pit. You go a little bit farther to Birmingham, there's a marl pit. Marl pits were all the rage in the late 1800s because they held fossils. And there was this thing called bone wars, where there was a guy from a museum in New York and a guy from the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia who were going around ripping each other off. They were paying the workmen in these marl pits to, whatever they found, telegraph me and I'll come pick them up. And then the next guy would come in and say, well, don't do that. If you find anything, telegram me and I'll give you this much money. And that went on for quite a while, and they actually wrote a book about it called Bone Wars. And it was the guy from the Academy of Natural Sciences was the guy who actually found the Hadrosaurus in Haddonfield. So more prehistoric history going way back. But of course, that's nothing new around here. You find shark's teeth and everything in the farmers' fields all the time from that, I want to say it's the Paleozoic era. How's that sound? You can check me on that. Anything else?
Is the factory still there?
Ah,
Yeah.
so just the ruins. And it's very sad. I'm not the most observant person in the world, and when the bridge closed by, some of us were parking that lived on that side. We were parking down by the factory, and I was walking up the hill one morning, and my boss was coming down, and I said, where are you going? And he said, oh, wall in the factory fell. I'm like, I just parked there. Are you serious? And I turned around and walked back down there, and sure enough, great big whole wall all in one piece had fallen down in a windstorm. The problem is, because of where it's located, right next to the lake, it's in a wetlands, and it floods. You know, whenever we have a 100-year storm, which has been like 3 or 4 times in the past 10 years, the area floods. And the rain-cocos is also considered bald eagle habitat. So the DEP really limits what we can do. Even as a park, we have to check. We had a canoe portage in one of our parks, and they said, no, you can't have a canoe portage there. You can make it a canoe rest area. So, no different. It's exactly the same. It's just on our map. We don't say portage. We say rest area. How's that sound? So, yeah, unfortunately, we couldn't save everything. So the workers' houses, the mansion, of course, some of the barns, mechanic's house, unfortunately, is gone. That was torn down in 1948. So, anything else?
When
Yes.
you're, sorry,
Go ahead.
when you're driving down and you're heading towards the mansions, a lot of those old houses, they were part of the village